Welcome to NRL Offside. I'm Noz. That's JC. At least I think that's JC. I never tell what side you're on, mate. Sometimes you're on the left of me, sometimes you're on the right. So we'll see how it transpires when we actually load the program up. And Johnny, we're going to start our show in a unique way this week. Now, I suspect there aren't many, if any, NRL podcasts that start by discussing the butterfly effect. But Johnny, mate, it's unavoidable for our episode of NRL Offside this week. And we're just about to get to that. Now, a lot of people know the butterfly effect, particularly our NRL Offside listeners. They're a very learned and erudite bunch. But just for those people that don't, mate, it is the element of chaos theory that states that a small, seemingly insignificant event is the precipitant for a massive cataclysmic event on the other end. So it gets its name from the conceit that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil sets off a massive tornado in Texas. Well, here in NRL Offside, JC, mate, we have our equivalent of that, and that came to the fore in last week's episode. Mate, that's the JC effect. Now, for those people that actually listened to the program last week, Johnny's freeballing section was about the desperate plight of the West Tigers, how they're an absolute shambles. And then, mate, what do you know? Less than 48 hours later, Adam Doueihi and Benji Marshall have their massive blow-up. Doueihi storms out of the Tigers training session, refuses to play on the weekend against the Raiders. Mate, coincidence? Mate, I think not. Now, you obviously don't even realise your impact, JC, but, mate, I'd just like to say this before you do get started. With great power comes great responsibility. So, mate, you better watch your words this week. You don't know what sort of an impact they're going to have. But what's happening with you, mate?
Yeah, g'day, Noz, and hello, listeners. I've got a different setting tonight. I'm in a hotel room down here in Melbourne. Look, yeah, all good on my side, though. Not so great news on the Tigers side, with another bloody headline coming out of Tiger Town with the Adam Doueihi news. Look, you could be right, Noz, about the JC butterfly effect. I must have jinxed them last week. So yeah, thanks for the mention. And mate, I'll also add that one to that saying to my vocab as well. But look, enough from me. As always, mate. Over to you, Captain Noz, for the first big hit up.
Well, mate, one of my secondary aims with this program is just to increase your word finding, so we can add that one to the list with ebullient. Now, mate, this week's program, speed rounds. Mate, we've got another cracking round to discuss. There was so much good football over the last few days. What caught our eye? Now, Johnny, you're pandering to our Bulldog friends again. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in Vox Popping. I'm discussing an exciting development on the Gold Coast. And Johnny, we're not talking about another high-rise in this circumstance. The grapple, well, we've already shown our hand a little bit with that, JC. Mate, for one of the worst teams in the competition, those Tigers can certainly generate a headline. Of course, we're going to be talking about the situation coming out of Concord with whatever's going on with Adam Doueihi and Benji Marshall at the moment. The round preview. Now, again, Johnny, I mentioned the fact we had a fascinating round of football over the last weekend. We've got a whole heap of fixtures coming up this weekend, which are going to be equally interesting. And freeballing is back to me this week. Now, I'll put my hand on my heart here, JC. I do promise that it will be purely about football. So no nonsensical tangents, no rubbish that doesn't make any sense. It's just going to be strictly business. Who'll thunk it? But, Johnny, let's put the key in the ignition.
I feel the need for speed. Ow!
Let's start with the Eels versus the Panthers. Look, the Panthers survived a scare in the Battle of the West with Parramatta bursting out to a 12-0 lead. Mate, then, as always happens, mate, the Panthers clicked into gear early in the second half, crossing for 3 quick tries that obviously ultimately sealed their result. Look, I think the Eels should probably feel a little bit hard done by with a couple of tough calls going against them in some pretty key moments. But in saying that, to not score a single point during the 2 periods when Penrith were reduced to 12 men, really that's unacceptable in today's game. And big shout to Milky Jenkins, who became Penrith's all-time leading try-season scorer, surpassing the great Reece Wester. So well done, Milky Jenkins. Let's move to the Knights versus my Roosters. Look, the Roosters were very fortunate escape with the 2 competition points in this one, with obviously a late field goal from DCE to clinch the result. It was a pretty scrappy performance from my boys. Lots of errors, lots of missed tackles. They can really thank James Tedesco for getting them home. Teddy was outstanding, bagging a hat trick in a timely return. I thought on the whole, but I thought the Knights were actually the better side for large periods of this match, to be honest. And now to make matters worse for the Knights, the loss has come at a bit of huge cost, with obviously Dylan Brown facing a potential ACL injury, and also Dylan Lucas has suffered a serious ankle injury. I think if both of these guys are sidelined for an extended period, mate, this could have a pretty significant impact on the Knights' chances of finishing in the top 8. Let's move to the Rabbitohs versus the Storm. Mate, this was a strange but highly sort of entertaining game. It was the sort of ultimate you score, I score contest. Every time it looked like one side had grabbed the momentum and was about to take control, the other responded pretty much also almost immediately to keep the scores quite tight. Late in the match, it sort of seemed like Melbourne had done enough to secure the victory, but then came a pretty cruel blow. Cody Walker was launching a 40-20 attempt, and then Sua Fa'alongo was racing back to make a play on the ball. But unfortunately, the bounce caught Sua on the leg before the ball rolled into touch, handing South a pretty prime attacking opportunity. And then obviously the Rabbitohs made the most of it with only a few minutes remaining. They marched downfield, and Campbell Graham's cross for the match-winning try, completing a pretty thrilling comeback victory by the Rabbitohs. This result was a massive blow to Melbourne's finals hopes, and I think it pretty much all ended their chances of making the top 8. And just to make matters worse, Harry Grant also appeared to suffer a pretty serious hamstring injury, which looks to sideline him for a period now as well. Let's move to the Raiders versus the hapless Tigers. Look, not much to say about this one other than it just keeps getting worse for the Tigers. They actually started the game reasonably well, but look, once Canberra's young attacking machine clicked in the gear, it was pretty much one-way traffic. Dane Laurie haunted his former club with a hat-trick, while young Ethan Sanders, their half, mate, he had a day out, piling on 24 points with 2 tries and 8 goals. It was enough. It was another tough afternoon for the Tigers, conceding 50-plus points yet again. And look, let's be fair, Jerome Luai had a game that he'd like to forget, and you can't help but wonder what Adam Doueihi was thinking watching this game all unfold.
Bulldogs versus Warriors. Now, in last week's preview of the round, Johnny, we were questioning which of the Bulldogs team is going to turn up. Now, they emphatically answered that question. We well and truly got the tough-minded Dogs of War. In a lot of ways, this was a game of moments. Simply put, the Dogs took their chances in attack while the Warriors didn't, or perhaps more accurately, Canterbury didn't let them take them. This was a classic Canterbury smother where the Warriors just couldn't get started. Now, no one's going to mistake the 2026 Bulldogs for the 1980 Hughes, Brentnell, Mortimer crew, but it has been a strong month of football, and there is something building with the boys from Belmore. I think those Bulldog noses just have a sniff of the semi-finals, Johnny. Cowboys versus Broncos. Well, this was another very, very willing encounter. The 18-12 scoreline belied the edge of your seat action of this game. Both teams really turned up, and it had the usual spice of the real Queensland derby. If anything, I thought the Broncos were unlucky not to take a lead into the break. They just couldn't quite land the final pass or get that final move, and that continued into the second half where they left plenty of points on the board. However, a large part of that was due to the Cowboys' defensive intensity and scramble. The boys from North Queensland played like their lives depended on it and may just have found their identity for the season just in time for the run to the semi-finals. I don't think this Cowboys team is a contender, but I do think that not too many of the real contenders want to see them in September. Dragons versus Titans. Now, I'm not going to lie here, JC. When the games were allocated last week, I wasn't really jumping out of my skin to watch this game. Mate, it was buried in what I call the 2018 Parramatta time slot, which is 2 p.m. on Sunday. But, mate, you know what? Mate, the first half of this game was great. Mate, we said it in the preview. it may have been a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It was a clash of Titans flash and Dragons grit, and that's pretty much how the first 40 turned out. Mate, the opening try to St George was a lovely hustle play from Gutho in game 250, no less, and it was followed by 3 Titan 4-pointers, courtesy of their increasingly potent left edge. A late first half try to Kyle Flanagan had the Dragons within striking distance going into the main break. And as they say in the classics, Johnny, the game was well and truly afoot. But that Titans flash started blinging in the second half with a 3-try-to-1 onslaught that pushed the boys from the Goldie out to a 20-point victory over a St George team. And while St George was far from being disgraced, they were somewhat overmatched. Now, the Sea Eagles versus the Sharks. Johnny, this might have been the most impactful game of the weekend. I'm going to start with the glass half full. I often get some criticism for being overly harsh on teams. But, mate, if the Sharks can maintain this form, they are contenders in a season where the Panthers' edge has dulled a little. The Chooks are still a work in progress, and the Warriors seem to be doing their Black Knight impersonation. Cronulla on Sunday, they were slick, they were fast, they were physically dominant, particularly in a first half where they laid on some really impressive tries. I don't know if you saw it, mate, but the Will Kennedy try set up by Oregon Kaufusi was the try of the round, if not the month. Now, a little less pleasantly, I'm going to flip the perspective. The Sea Eagles glass was completely empty. Fosball, and we've debated long into the night about what Fosball is. Well, last Sunday, it looked disturbingly like Origin Game 1 Lozball. Let's take our 2 best attacking players, Olakawada and Kula, and put them as far away as possible from the ball. That said, that wasn't the reason they lost this game. The Manly team was completely off the pace from the opening whistle. This is now 6 losses from the last 7 for the Sea Eagles, and their semi-hopes look kaput despite a softish run home. Well, Johnny, it was obvious from that speed round that there was a heap going on over the weekend. Mate, what caught your eye?
Look, you touched on it a little bit earlier. The Bulldogs, mate. I've got to give the Bulldogs a huge rap for their performance against the Warriors. Going into this game, I did give the Dogs a small chance, but to be honest, I really thought the Warriors would be basically too strong for the Dogs. Well, I got that one completely wrong. The Bulldogs are outstanding. We all know how good their defence can be, but what really impressed me was their attack. It was probably the best I've seen them play with the ball in hand for a bloody long time. Lachlan Galvin controlled the game quite nicely, while Kickow, Stephen Crichton and the rest of the side played with much more confidence and creativity that we've seen in recent times. I reckon a lot of Dogs fans would have been saying, where has that attack been all season? Mate, it was a massive confidence-boosting win for the Dogs, but the real test now is obviously how they back up this week to keep their finals 8 runs still alive. But look, the Dogs fans will be buzzing right now, so great stuff, the Bulldogs. And I forgot to maybe mention at the start, congratulations to Tim Zhu on winning his fight against Errol Spence on Sunday. Mate, I'd love to see Tim win a world title, so go Tim Zhu in your next fight.
Yeah, mate, that was an excellent effort. In talking about the Bulldogs, I didn't mention in the introduction, JC, you are pandering a little bit to all those Bulldogs fans in our life. We're going to get to that in Vox Popping. They have been unfairly targeting me, JC. I need to fight back in this episode, mate. There are a couple of things that actually caught my eye. The first was relatively unpleasant, and mate, that was the carnage out of Friday night's 2 games. Mate, you've already mentioned the Newcastle game. Unfortunately, Newcastle lost their best forward in Dylan Lucas. They lost their best player in Dylan Brown. Mate, I think they're cooked for season 2026 as a result of those unfortunate injuries. In the Melbourne game, we saw some injuries in that as well. So we saw Brandon Smith go down with not 1, but 2 calf injuries. Then later on in the weekend, we saw Harry Hayes' dreadful ear injury. Mate, it was just a weekend of absolute carnage, which just shows how much these players are absolute warriors. But that's not necessarily the thing that caught my eye, Johnny. The thing that caught my eye was the Gold Coast, and particularly the Gold Coast spine. Now, mate, we don't often talk about the Gold Coast Titans, and when we do talk about them, we often are joking about their performance. But, mate, their spine is really starting to grow into itself. So Keanu Kinney at fullback, We've got Zane Harrison at number 7. We've got Jaden Campbell at 5'8", and we've got young Justin Pascoe at number 9. Now, in terms of Keanu Kinney, mate, he's probably not quite Billy Slater, but he might be Roger Tuivasa-Sheck. Mate, he has that uncanny ability to go into the line and somehow just pop out the other side. Zane Harrison, mate, he's a mere 19 years old. He has stepped into that team like he was born to it. He is now leading them around the park very capably. I think he has 8 or 9 try assists over that period of time as well. So he's really addressed one of that team's glaring weaknesses, which is their ability to get into the grind. And Justin Pascoe, mate, we love a feel-good story in the NRL. Mate, less than 6 months ago, this bloke was making a quid as a Tyler, and now he's one of the form number 9s in the competition. But, Johnny, the big one of this quartet is Jaden Campbell. We have been watching Jaden Campbell now for the better part of 3 or 4 years. He's really been developing as a footballer. But, mate, this season there is something about him. He seems to have taken that up to the next level. And this might come across as a little bit strange, Johnny, but you know who he reminds me of? He reminds me of Cody Walker. Now, he has those incredible hands. He has the ability to sum up a situation 5 seconds before everybody else, and he's both a passing and a running threat. He's probably a little bit better a runner than Cody and not quite the passer, but mate, there is a degree of parity between those two. Mate, he also has that ability to get his edge humming. Mate, that left edge was brilliant. Admittedly, it was against the Dragons, but he sliced St. George to pieces on Sunday. Now, here's where it is a little bit brighter for the Titans. He doesn't have Cody's temperament, that propensity to go on tilt, to lose it when the red mist descends. And, mate, if he keeps up this current vein of form and he continues his development, I think within a couple of years, Jaden Campbell's going to be one of the best pivots we have in the competition. Now, here's where it gets interesting, Johnny. The track record of the Titans is not great when it comes to maximising their talent. They've often puddled around, lost players to other teams and had those players go on to bigger and better things. But let's just hope that they can nurture this current crop, because the future, mate, it might just be as bright as their ridiculous popsicle jerseys. Now the grapple. Oh God, we ended that on a relatively positive note, Johnny. Now we're going to go into the grapple. Mate, we mentioned this. We keep having to talk about these West Tigers. There's only one topic we can discuss this week, JC. That is the Adam Doueihi situation at the West Tigers. Mate, what are your thoughts on the whole palaver?
Look, I was thinking about this today. Look, I could easily jump on the Doueihi sort of hate train like everyone else. And look, and I understand most of the criticism. He's walked away from his teammates, and that's pretty hard to defend. But I also, mate, I also understand why he did it. I think he's just clearly had enough. He obviously feels his position in the squad has not been valued. And I was talking about this last episode, but the person that seems to come out of all of this relatively unscathed is Jerome Luai. Mate, he was the guy at the centre of the drama when Galvin was leading last season, and obviously more recently there's been all that noise surrounding his future. Obviously first with PNG, and now more recently with Parramatta Eels next season. And clearly Luai is not part of the Tigers' long-term future, and that's why I can understand why Doueihi's taken a stand. He believed he should have been wearing the number 7 jersey, particularly after going to the judiciary and successfully having his charge downgraded so he could play. So I actually understand Adam's position, but obviously the difficult part now will be facing his teammates. Some will probably support him, and maybe others may not. And as for Benji and Doueihi's relationship, I really think that's probably seriously strained now. Time will tell whether Doueihi remains at the Tigers. And I was joking about this in our little school chat, but Uncle Nick, if you are listening, I reckon Adam Doueihi would look pretty good in a Roosters jersey, especially with his cousin assistant coach Michael Checker already at the Chooks. So I think everyone go easy on Doueihi. He's definitely been one of the Tigers' best players all season, and in my opinion, I think he has every right to make his case loud and strong.
Mate, if he does happen to go to the Roosters, they'll have to make him co-halfback. because the mail coming out of Bondi is just about to sign Sam Watford to a long-term contract. So maybe they can have a 7A and a 7B if Doueihi goes there. Mate, I do like the fact that you are taking the opposite side of the story. There's been a lot in the media over the last, probably 4 or 5 days, and most of it has been bashing Doueihi. You mentioned the Doueihi hate train. Well, mate, it has plenty of people on it at the moment. And, mate, it's always tough to get a beat on these sort of situations. We never know exactly what's transpired. It's a truism that there's always two sides to every story. And as I said, mate, I think your little section there was well put, and it was very timely because it's nice to get a different perspective. Mate, that said, I'm going to reach into my pocket right now and pull out my ticket for the Doueihi hate train because, mate, I just cannot fathom this situation. Doueihi if the information that we've got is accurate, Doueihi has walked out because he didn't want to play out of his preferred position at halfback. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest here, JC, a little bit like you were brutally honest about your mate Jerome Luai. Mate, if that's the case, this is absolute garbage from Doueihi. Now, first and foremost, this is a job. Now, if I turn up to work tomorrow and my boss asks me to do something which is in the scope of what I'm getting paid to do, I just go ahead and do it. Now, Doueihi was asked to play a different position. Mate, Benji didn't give him a mop and bucket and ask him to go clean the toilets or ask him to serve lunch or go do a Miyagi and clean everybody's cars. Mate, he just asked him to play a different position. And, mate, he's played plenty of football in the back row while he's been at the West Tigers as well. Mate, if nothing else, his response puts him and the club at the point of no return from an employment perspective. I know everybody's playing happy families at the moment. We had a story today that they met. The Benji was there, the GM from the West Tigers was there, and everybody came out singing Kumbaya. But, mate, I just can't see how this is salvageable. Now, the next part, Johnny, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in the program, mate, rugby league, or sport in general, I mean, you mentioned Tim Tszyu, it's certainly the case in boxing, but, mate, rugby league in particular is one of those sports where it's all about the intangibles. Yeah, mate, we know the players get paid handsomely. We know they're going to jump ship to another team when they get offered more money. We know that they probably don't live and die on the results as much as we do as fans. But, mate, equally, we know that these men and women go out onto the field every week and put themselves on the line. Mate, they literally stand shoulder to shoulder with their 12 teammates. They do their utmost for the teams. And, mate, we love those teams. And that's what we want to see our players doing. Mate, that is the bond that we have with those players. And, mate, for mine, Adam Doueihi with his selfish, petulant and childish act of storming out, but he not only put himself above the team, but he broke that bond. Now, I'm going to say it here, JC, there may well be other facts that come out. If they are and if they mitigate the circumstances, mate, I'll happily stand corrected. I'll put my hand on my heart and apologise for Adam Doueihi for my harsh words. I actually like the bloke as well. Mate, I'm a big fan of his game. I think the West Tigers are a much better team when he's in the starting lineup. But, mate, it is really hard to put his actions in a positive light. I have lost a fair bit of respect for him, and we'll just have to see how this pans out, mate, because, again, I'm just looking at this and shaking my head at the moment. Oh, a bit of controversy, JC. I love it. I love it. Now, let's move on to the round preview, mate, to see if you can give us a degree of normality, some sanity here, mate.
All right, let's start with the Dragons versus Dolphins. I'm not sure if I'll give you any sanity, but this is my crazy tip. So look, clearly on paper, the Dolphins, mate, have far more strike power and probably should win this game by plenty. But this is my crazy tip for this weekend. I've just got this sneaking feeling about the Dragons in cold Wollongong. I reckon they can win, but obviously they'll need to contain Mr. Hammer. If the Dragons can limit his impact, I just think you never know. So I'm tipping the upset of the season. I'm going for the Dragons in Wollongong to beat the Finns.
Mate, when I read this tip in the show notes, I was just wondering exactly what you'd seen to indicate that you thought the Dragons were already showing this game. But I was actually thinking, and you know I have to come with my usual flowery metaphor here, JC. But, mate, we talked a few weeks ago about the Leyland P76, which is commonly regarded as the worst car ever made in Australia. Mate, they used to make them over in Zetland, so just up the road from where I am now. Now, mate, basically what you're saying is that if a Leyland P76 was racing against a Ferrari on Zetland Avenue, it'd win. They're rather than in Monza or someplace in Italy. Mate, let me just tell you this, and I'll tell you pretty straight. the location doesn't change the relative quality of the teams. Mate, the Dragons are stout. They have a go, but they played the Titans on the weekend and were overwhelmed. Mate, this Dolphins team has much more firepower than the Titans. I think they're going to belt the Dragons. I don't even think it's going to be close, mate. But again, if they do get up, you can throw this back in my face next week.
All right, mate. Let's move to the Storm versus the Bulldogs. Look, after Melbourne's heartbreaking loss to South last week, I think their finals hopes are over. And obviously, to make matters worse, they're going to be without Harry Grant. Look, if the Dogs can bring that same intensity, that defensive resolve, and an attacking spark they showed against the Warriors, I think they'll be too strong. A win here could also see the Dogs sneak back into the top 8, depending on some other results. So I'm tipping the Dogs to head down to Melbourne and come away with a big win.
Mate, I am actually now officially worried about you. The two expressions, heartbreaking and Melbourne Storm, should never, ever be used in the same sentence. But again, I'm going to one up my low and P76 one here. Mate, you remember the scene in Gremlins where they blew up the cinema full of evil gremlins? Mate, that was about as heartbreaking as watching the Melbourne Storm lose the other night. And mate, in addition to that, mate, the game last Friday night, mate, it wasn't some emotional last-second defeat. It was one side in the South Sydney Rabbitohs bumbling slightly less than the other. But you mentioned it was a surreal game, but it wasn't a high-quality game. Mate, Melbourne have been on borrowed time since May, and now that time has mercifully run out. And you know who hasn't been merciful, Johnny? The Bulldogs over the last month. Mate, I expect them to maul the Melbourne Storm in a very similar fashion to what they've done over the last fortnight.
All right, let's move to the Titans versus the Warriors. Look, the Warriors missed a golden opportunity last week to keep their minor premiership hopes alive, and I think they'll be desperate to bounce back. The Titans, on the other hand, mate, they've shown that they can trouble teams when they get into that sort of nice attacking rhythm, especially on their home track. It's actually the Warriors' second straight game in Oz, this time on the Goldie. And a bit like the Dragons over the Finns, I just have a feeling this has upset written all over it. So I'm actually going to tip the Titans to upset the Warriors up on the Gold Coast.
But I'm going to do a bit of a U-turn and agree with you here. I think with the Warriors, we're now into believe your eyes territory. But they've just lost way too many troops. I was watching them last week, and this has been building over the last month or so of football. Mate, they are now a middling team with reasonable forwards, but glaring attacking and speed deficiencies. And mate, that is the strength of this Titans team. We talked about it in speed rounds. This Titan team can put on points. I think a large measure of this game will be played in the middle, and that's another thing that the Titans have really improved over the last couple of weeks. Mate, I'm often critical of Tino. I think at times it looks like he's just turning up to cash his check on the Gold Coast, but he's been fantastic over the last couple of weeks, and he's had very able support from both Therma, from Mo Fotuaika, from Aruda Howe. But they've been good in the middle, and I think the Titans can actually hold the Warriors in the middle of the ground. And if they do that, mate, I think those Gold Coast backs are going to run right. I am going one up on you, Johnny. I think the Titans are going to win, but I also think they're going to put a score on the Warriors. I think it's going to be really quite surprising.
Okay, stay tuned. Let's look at the Panthers versus the Raiders. This one heads back to Mudgee. And who could forget the famous Battle of Mudgee a few years ago? So hopefully we're in for another classic. Look, mate, the Raiders have been in terrific form over the past month, with obviously their outside backs causing all sorts of problems in attack. They're playing with plenty of confidence at the moment. Penrith, on the other hand, as we've said a few times, they just haven't looked like their sort of dominant Panthers that we've come to expect. They've been a bit patchy the last month or so, but look, we are heading into that golden run, heading into the finals. I think their form will start to pick up. I'm tipping the Panthers in a tight one, and it's a real shame that Hudson Young is out. He would have been really fired up for this clash, I reckon.
Mate, I think you actually hit the nail right on the head when you said that this Canberra team is one of the form teams in the competition. There are currently 3 teams that are on a 4-game winning streak: the Roosters, the Sharks, and the Raiders. Now, that said, mate, the Penrith have been off the boil. We've been talking about that a little bit over the last few weeks, but their defence is still top-notch. And, mate, I really think that the Raiders just have a propensity to have some defensive lapses. I'm actually tipping the Panthers. I think this is going to be a surprising defensive tussle. And I think that strength of defense for the Panthers will get them over the line.
Let's move to the Broncos versus the Knights. Look, Brisbane's finals hopes they're over now. The Knights, meanwhile, mate, this is a danger game on their hands. Losing both Dylan Brown and Dylan Lucas is a massive blow. And if they drop this one, their grip on a final spot really starts to look pretty shaky, particularly with the Bulldogs charging home. Even though the Broncos can't make the finals, I just think they'll have too much strike power across the park, and obviously they'll want to bounce back with a win at their home ground up in Suncorp.
Mate, you mentioned heartbreaking when you were talking about the Melbourne Storm, and obviously I poo-pooed that. Mate, what was heartbreaking last week were those 2 injuries to the Dylans in the Newcastle game, because that really puts a sizable dent in the Newcastle team as they make a run to the semis. And they were a delightful surprise this season. I was really enjoying their football. But, mate, the reality is that both of these teams had a stake put through their hearts last week. While the Knights lost their best couple of players, the Broncos had their very slim chances of a semi-final berth extinguished. But I'm actually going for the Knights in this one. The Broncos have been pretty dour, and I just think that young irrepressibility, particularly of the Fletchers for Newcastle, will get them over the line. But we're going to be watching this game, and it's going to be a massive what-if for both teams, I think.
Let's go to the Sharks versus the Rabbitohs. This one shapes up as a really intriguing clash. South showed plenty of heart last week, coming from the clouds to win a memorable victory over Melbourne. Whilst the Sharks, as you mentioned earlier, mate, they've been quietly going about their business, banking some pretty big wins off the back of their key guys. A lot of this game depends on who South get back. If the likes of Cam Murray and a few of their other big names return, they can probably make a little bit of a contest of it. But as I said, I just think the Sharks will probably have too much class. Mate, Nico Hines, he's probably in career best form at the moment. And look, Braden Trindle, if Nathan Cleary doesn't win the Dally N this year, I think Braden Trindle is only a whisker behind. And their underrated forward pack should really see Cronulla come away with the 2 competition points in this one.
Mate, they belted the Seagulls last week, the Sharks. Their speed of play, their physicality, their creativity, mate, they were just way, way too much for the Seagulls. And if I'm being honest, mate, I think this South team is closer to Manly than they are the Sharks. I thought their game against the Storm was the equivalent of the Fast and Furious Part 7. Mate, it was entertaining rubbish. I really think the Sharks are going to torch them, particularly at home. I've said this time and time again. I am happy to say it again. I think this South team are absolute pretenders, and I think the Sharks are going to expose them on the weekend.
Mate, I would love to look back at all of our 22 or so episodes. How many times you've said Souths are contenders?
Pretenders.
Pretenders. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to keep saying it too, mate. Don't worry about that.
All right, let's go to the Tigers versus your boys. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet, mate. This is a nothing game. The only interest for me is Adam Doueihi. Does he play? Does he get a release from the club? Mate, Parra to win comfortably. There you go.
Mate, I don't know if you watched last week's game. It sounded like you watched the whole game with the Tigers versus Canberra. But, mate, at the 20th minute of the first half, Api Coruscant got a 40-20. Now, it put the Tigers in a great position to even the score. At the time, the score actually favoured the Raiders 10 points to 6. So there the Tigers were. They were about 15 metres out from the Raiders' line. Really, really good opportunity. Now, Johnny, this is what transpired. On the second tackle, Jerome Luai threw a ridiculous Harbour Bridge pass. It hemmed the winger Junior Tupou on the touchline. He struggled to stay in and drop the ball. Then the Tigers challenged the play. It was obviously a loose carry, so they lost their challenge. In the ensuing Raiders set, they gave away 2 set restarts, and it ended in the softest of Ethan Strange tries, where he barged right through the centre of the West's defence and scored just adjacent to the posts. Ladies and gentlemen, your 2026 West Tigers. Now, Parra, on the other hand, mate, I thought they were good against the Panthers. They do have a tendency to lose their way. They may play down to this West's team, but the Tigers are so bad at the moment, mate, I can't see them winning. In fact, with their current form, mate, I don't think they'd win a chook raffle if they had every ticket. They're just ridiculously bad.
Oh, Jesus. I'm just waiting for Ash's text message. All right, mate. Let's go to the final one, the game of the round, and it's the Cows versus my boys, the Roosters. Look, mate, this shapes, in my opinion, is one of the games of the year. Both sides are coming off last start wins, but for mine, the Cowboys' performance was far, far more convincing than the Roosters' win. The Cows' outside backs were absolutely electric with Drinkwater. I'm loving this kid Jenkins, and obviously they got Purdue, and a very capable and skillful forward pack the Cows have. Now, look, this is going to be a huge test for the Chooks, especially up in the humidity of Townsville. The formula for the Roosters is pretty simple. We just need to complete our sets at a high rate, keep those errors to a minimum, which has clearly been our Achilles heel all season. And I think defensively, we also need to be switched on because the Cows, they can pretty much punish you from anywhere on the field. I can't wait for this one. It should be a cracker. So come on, my Roosters.
Johnny, I thought you were uncharacteristically hard on your Roosters for their performance against the Knights. Mate, it was a high-octane game. I thought the Chooks took the Knights' best punches, and they finished in a style which was befitting a contender. They coolly executed, they kicked that field goal, won the game in the last 3 or 4 minutes. But I'd also like to say that despite all of the so-called experts last year decrying the purchase of DCE, mate, last week's game was the exact reason that they brought DCE across, just so they could have that cool head, that experienced person on the field that could step up in those situations. The boys, mate, you said it, they were dynamic and tough in an end-to-end game against the Broncos. I think the vital piece of the puzzle in this game is the late season renaissance of Jason Taumalolo. Mate, I think Jason Taumalolo, as well as some of the other Cowboys forwards, will really be able to stand up to Nafahu White and those inform Roosters forwards. I think it's going to be a great match. I am tipping the home team. I'm sorry, Johnny. I think the boys will get the chocolates, but it's going to be very, very close. Okay, now we are on to freeballing, guys. It is back to me this week, but as I said in the introduction, I promise, Johnny, there will be no flim-flammery. It is all strictly football today.
'Cause I'm free balling, yeah. Free balling, ooh, free.
In fact, today is a multi-parter. It's a first in a multi-parter about building a successful team. Now, this comes off your portentous freeballing subject about the West Tigers last week, mate. Not only was it sort of causing ructions at Concord, but it got me thinking. Mate, when you think about the West Tigers, here is a club that has not been able to get out of its own way for the better part of 2 decades. And it becomes even more interesting when you compare them to the Melbourne Storm. So the Melbourne Storm actually came into the competition the year before the Tigers-Magpie merger in 99. They somehow managed to build a competition-winning team within 12 months, and pretty much every year since, they have been in the sniff for the competition. So this week, it's the first of a couple of parts of looking at what makes a successful team. Now, the first thing, and the most obvious, is good management. These clubs are always led by people who know what they're doing. They usually have a dominant figure, or often a couple of them, who are real leaders within that club. Now, I thought of a few examples here, Johnny. Again, not wanting to continue with our Bulldogs pandering, but the best examples I could think of were the Bulldogs in the 80s. So they had the Bullfrog, Peter Moore, running the football and running the Leeds club, and they had Warren Ryan, who was their sort of coaching Svengali. The Storm of the 2000s, may they have had 2 equally dominant personalities in Frank Panisi, who is their GM of football, and of course, Craig Bellamy. And the people in charge of the club, Johnny, they often have an understanding of the tangibles and the intangibles of footy. For the tangibles, this one's pretty obvious. It may even be the subject of the second part. You need good players. You need a recruitment strategy. But more importantly, Johnny, you need a recruitment strategy that actually matches the club's position. So I'm going to use a couple of opposite examples here. I'm going to talk about Melbourne and Penrith. Now, the Storm, they were a club which was basically made from nothing in enemy territory. Throughout their history, they have relied on strong scouting. And that strong scouting has usually been in Queensland and New Zealand. I mean, the best example amongst many, or the best 2 examples amongst many, is this is a club that pulled Brandon Smith and Jerome Hughes out of the lower grades at the Cowboys. Now, the Panthers, on the other hand, mate, they've created an incredible pipeline from their great strength, which is their fertile junior stocks. Year after year, in fact, it was pretty much from the time Luke Capewell left the club after they won the premiership in 2021. They lose superstars and they just manage to replace them. But these teams also get the right people in the right positions throughout the organisation. Now, when you think about positions like coaching assistants, front office people, even training staff, mate, the example I'm going to give here is one which is very close to my heart, and that's Jack Gibson's assistants at Parramatta. Now, the first of those assistants was Ron Massey. They've named a cup after him, Johnny. But, mate, he was, according to all sources, a man who had forgotten more about football than anybody else knew. And also John Mooney, who went on to lead one of the most successful premiership campaigns ever with the Eels in 1986. I can vaguely remember that, Johnny. I'm holding on to it. But there's another couple of tangible things. Mate, success also requires a strength of will and courage. Mate, there hasn't ever been a successful club or indeed a successful organisation in any endeavour that is afraid of making the hard decisions. Now, you can probably remember some of these, Johnny, but Phil Gould in 1988, dropping Steve Mortimer in round 7, not only stripping him of the captaincy, but taking him completely out of his beloved number 7 jersey and putting him on the bench. The other one, which you probably remember even more fondly, was in 2018 when your Roosters boned Mitchell Pearce for Cooper Cronk. And what did that lead to, Johnny? Back-to-back premierships in 18 and 19. And we've mentioned it, Penrith, year after year, just offload superstars. They're not going to kill their salary cap by breaking the banks for the like of Billy Kickow, Stephen Crichton or Matt Burton. Now, the final piece of the tangible puzzle, Johnny, is off-the-field business success. That can be the Parramatta and Canterbury Leeds clubs of the 80s, the corporate behemoth that was the Brisbane Broncos in the 90s, the willingness of News Corp to pour huge sums of money into the Melbourne Storm. You need to be successful off the park as well as on the park. But, Johnny, there's also the intangibles of being a good organisation. Mate, you have to have a certain arrogance. You have to have a certain swag in your step. Mate, you have to have ambition, but most of all, you need to have an identity. Mate, when I think of those things, I can't help but recall the Broncos during their golden era from 92 to 06. Mate, when the Brisbane team came into town, everybody knew it. They expected to win the game. They expected to win the comp every single year. But most of all, they knew exactly who they were. They were going to beat the tripe out of you in the forwards and then have you helplessly watch on as their supersonic backs ran rings around you. Now, when it comes to the elements of management, Johnny, don't ask me which is the most important. This isn't a recipe. I don't have the exact proportions to be replicated. It's far from an exact science. And, mate, in a lot of circumstances, there's a fair degree of good fortune and being in the right place at the right time. And, Johnny, that's where we're going to leave it this week, mate. In the next part, in a fortnight's time, we're going to be discussing the most important element, the element that has the biggest component of catching lightning in a bottle, and that is the playing group. So everyone can look forward to that, Johnny. Beauty. Free balling. Okay, vox popping. We are on to the outro, Johnny. And I mentioned this a bit earlier, mate. Last week I was targeted by all of those Bulldogs fans on our WhatsApp thread. And this one came from friend of the program, an indeed close friend of ours, Pablo Norbury. But this is what Norbs wrote. Nos, the MCR Doggies fans have been chatting on our separate WhatsApp channel, and there is much debate about why you dislike the Dogs so much. Firstly, throwing cheap shots at our amazing team, and now at their awesome supporters. We just can't put our fingers on it. Well, let me help you out here, Norbs. Steve Folkes' fiberglass shoulder pads in the 84 grand final. Everything that Peter Kelly did from 1984 to 1987, and the last 11 minutes of the 1998 prelim final. But, mate, I have now made it my life's objective to join this Bulldog chat. Another mate of ours, Andrew Faulkner, has said that I can join if I'm willing to watch the last 15 minutes of the 98 prelim final. Mate, if I did that, I'd have to be like Alex in A Clockwork Orange with my eyelids prized open. That sounds way too painful. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to just open a burner account and say I'm Pete Daly. Mate, I think that'll get me into it. And I'd also like to give a big shout out to our mate, Jimmy Vespa. Again, he's always listening to the program. He's a great fella. He's recovering after a pretty big operation last week. Vessi, we wish you all the best. Rest up and get well, mate. What do you got for Vox Popping, Johnny?
Look, from my side, our Tigers mate Ashus continues to message from afar. I think he's currently floating around some old Soviet mining town. Anyway, Asher wrote to me during the week and said, "Hey, I'm very impressed. A couple of 50-year-olds have managed to navigate a TikTok account." Mate, I absolutely love it, mate. We are building our presence, Noz. Get on the socials, everyone. That's it for me, mate.
Oh, mate, you're doing my job for me. I love it. So we have come to the end of the program, guys. Johnny said it. We are on Instagram, NRL_offside. We are on TikTok, NRL offside. We've started to post some comments through the week, guys. I was up there on Friday and then on Saturday again, just talking about a few things related to the greatest game of all. Make sure you do subscribe as well, guys. So if you do subscribe, it means we hit your feed nice and early on release, and provide feedback as well. So we've had a little bit of feedback, but it's always nice to hear from our listeners. So I've got our email addresses, jc@nrloffside.com, noz@nrloffside.com. But this has been an absolute blast this week, guys. Thank you very much for joining us again. We will hopefully see you this time next week.
Stay well, listeners. Have a great week.